All right, a few quick first points before we get to these main points of today, and that is, much of what we're talking about today is going to involve the Holy Roman Empire. Now, from the 800s, 900s to the 1400s. Now, this, you can see in the center of this map is the Holy Roman Empire. And from this vantage point, you can also see the papal state and Naples, etc. From this vantage point, this map looks pretty clear, all right? But in reality, if you've ever done any history on the Holy Roman Empire, it can be confusing with all the names and the baronies and the Saxonies and the this and the that. That's because this is a more accurate map of all the different territories, states, the papal state, the different baronies, the different bishoprics, and all the rest. So, even as it had these borders, it was quite a confused state of affairs. So that's number one, just to wrap your mind around that. Number two is, in the overarching picture, I wanted to make sure everybody understood that there is a lot of interference and overlap between church and state in this period. Most of the time, the church was asked to interfere. So even we're going to see several popes, many of which have some glaring faults and whatnot. But in the overall scheme of things, the secular or the state powers were usually asking for the blessing and imprimatur of the ecclesiastical authorities, which then you get the ecclesiastical authorities giving into that temptation. Their own power becomes more, and then you get a tug of war, like the Pope is like, hey, I think I want to be in charge of this whole deal. Emperor says, no, I want to be in charge of this whole deal. So it wasn't, because sometimes we can look back and say, how do you get this encroaching situation where the Pope becomes effectively in charge of Europe? And the reason is because there's years and years of erosion, and where the secular powers are asking for that. It's not just some magical, everybody's like, hey, let's put the Pope in charge. It's not that. And the people aren't that, benighted. Like, they're just as smart as we are in that regard. The third thing, before we get into just the data of this period, is I wanted to go through this briefly, give the ecclesiastical context of where we arrive after these, at the end of this, right before the Reformation. And John Gerstner puts it this way. He says, once upon a time, salvation was by Jesus Christ. All right? That's a good story so far. By the 13th century, salvation was by the church. It was alleged that salvation was by the grace of God alone, but that grace was available from the church alone. So remember, they never denied, nobody ever denied that salvation was by grace. But what happened is this muddle where the church became more and more the intermediary, the functional intermediary, and again, those blurred lines, like I mentioned, the map lines, the line between secular and ecclesiastical, the line between grace alone and the line between and mediated by the church. So, good morning, everybody, by the way.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. No, that's fine. Welcome, welcome. So just giving a little preamble, we haven't hit the notes yet. So it was alleged that salvation was by grace of God alone, but that grace was available from the church alone. So think of it this way: the saving gospel medicine came from above, from God, but it was given to the church to be administered by her, and that was a recipe for problems. So it was a very neat theological package, and in one sense, people could be very sure of what's my standing with God? Well, I know exactly what my standing with God is because the church has told me what it is, and they've given me these steps. The church administered baptism to the infants, which brought their regeneration. Now, this is the Roman Catholic view. The church administered confirmation, which brought the strengthening Holy Spirit. The church administered the Eucharist, which fed the people with the body of Christ for the Christian journey. The church in confession administered forgiveness and required penitence for sins committed. The church, by extreme unction, prepared the soul for transition to heaven. For the clergy, the church administered indelible orders, and for the laity, marriage. So, it was a very neat package. Absolute certitude of salvation in the ecclesiastical way from, as the saying goes, from womb to tomb, was guaranteed by the church. You knew exactly where you stood. I was baptized. I was confirmed. The other sacrament of marriage. You had this whole, or before death, I had the extreme unction. There's only one problem. The system will not work. It will not work because baptism does not regenerate. Love is not produced apart from regeneration. The works would not be meritorious, even if they were good works, which they are not. All the sins of an unregenerate person are mortal, and the penitential system is purely human performance, and as such, purely useless. So on the one hand, the Roman Catholic Church was getting it more and more dialed in. On the other hand, as we'll see at the end of today's lesson, there were people who were resisting that and saying that seems to not, we seem to be veering off more and more from what Scripture gives warrant for. So that's kind of the overall background. For those of you that arrived late, some of the confusion from this era with the Holy Roman Empire, this is a simplified map, but the true number of baronies, Saxonies, and is this. So you see a lot of, if you do read the history of this period and you're confused, it's for good reason. It is confusing. You're like, wait a minute, who did the bishopric and who was in charge of the Bohemian? Okay. So we'll hit the road running here. Now this period was very rich in theology, lots of important events and people we're going to talk about. Thank you, Lila, for the 6 points. We're now in number 1, introduction. So let's give a little time to this setting. First of all, roots of conflict and the seeds of renewal, as you have on your sheets in front of you. As James mentioned last week, Charlemagne united much of Europe. However, almost as soon as Charlemagne had succeeded in uniting Europe under his rule, a new wave of invasions began to flood the continent in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Vikings from the north, including Danes, who were then some of the world's most fierce warriors, Muslims from the south, and Hungarians from the east. Over time, Charlemagne's empire dissolved into numerous smaller kingdoms. You saw that one here. Controlled by local barons and nobles. The common people began to look not to the emperor for protection, but to their more accessible and efficient local lords who siphoned away the power of the imperial crown. Christianity spreads throughout Europe. During these 2 centuries, the Christian faith also experienced a geographic expansion unlike any it had seen before or would see for several centuries. Just as the barbarian invaders of Rome had embraced the Christian religion of their new land centuries earlier, so now missionaries began preaching in those very lands from which the invaders had come to ravage Europe. In a short time, almost all of Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and most of Sweden had come under the Christian name. Christianity also made great strides in lands such as Iceland, Greenland, Russia, and Hungary, and even a Muslim tribe in Mesopotamia embraced the Christian faith. Now you've got another point on your sheet that says political setting, investiture. You guys see that? And simony. Is it on? Okay. Simony, by the way, is the buying and selling of ecclesiastical privileges. Now here's, again, some muddy waters. The institutional church was not well from the late 9th century to the early 10th century. The feudal system, anybody know what the feudal system is? Want to give it a whack at describing? Nathan, you can put your hand down. Go for it.
I think it's just bunches of serfs working for a lord, essentially a bunch of lords.
Yep. It's characterized by a lack of a strong central government. The king owned all the land, leased parts to local lords, who leased to lesser nobles, and so on to peasants. So the feudal system grew, and so did the grab for religious authority. The church was intrinsically enmeshed in the feudal system as part of it. For example, a monastery could own land, and those who farmed the land were paying not a local lord, but the monastery. Individual churchmen, such as bishops, might be rich landowners in their own right. Religious appointments themselves were granted by lords, just as they granted the right to own or work land. The old issue of the relative powers of state and church was reappearing, and confrontation was inevitable, since the Pope was hardly going to let local warlords decide who should minister to the flock. This was known, and you can look it up online because it's known by term, the investiture controversy. So in investiture, a king, baron, or noble would grant or invest a property to a priest or bishop as a way of granting that church leader a position of religious authority. So while many clerics gained much wealth through accumulating these properties, they also lost their authority as independent ministers of God. Example, Washington State Congress or Mayor of Linwood appoints James Harleman as pastor of Refuge and gives him this church property. That's what it would be like. So the reason you can see as these start to get, a point I made, I think perhaps before some of you came in here, was the church was often responding at the behest of secular authorities. And so you can see in this case, the secular authorities give land to the church. The problem is the church begins to feel their stride and like, hey, yeah, I kind of like this. In fact, it gets to the point where not only do I like this, but really I think I should be calling the shots. Since you already gave your implicit approval to my authority anyway, because you said, I'm going to give you as a bishop, I'm going to give you this land. So it wasn't so much a just a naked power grab where the bishops were marching down the street, hey, give me this and give me this. Usually it was an unhealthy, incestuous relationship where the secular authorities wanted the ecclesiastical blessing and gave land, gave wealth, and then problems proceed.
I got a question.
Yeah.
How did they get the authority? What started the authority of electing the lords and the people or power, I guess you could say? It wasn't the peasant people, was it?
How did they get the authority? I want to make sure I understand your question.
Yeah.
Of
just owning, just being a lord or a king.
Oh,
or
okay.
something like that.
Well, that's some of that is you can trace back through history. Some of it is unknown because it's in some cases it's who's there first. But you saw the ugly map,
Yeah.
right? So there's probably a different story for every one of these colors. They're the people who were either there first and just kind of said, well, we claim this, I claim this in the name of the King of Bohemia in 540 AD or whatever. And through a series of battles and clashes, you either retain or expand the possession of it. And that's, I mean, if you watch one of those time-lapse videos of Europe over 2,000 years, there's no shortage of, you'll see the borders like
Change
all over the place.
Architect.
Yeah. So the 10th, and we're now in Worlds Collide, Emperors versus Popes. Sounds like a bad video game. The 10th and 11th centuries witnessed a bitter struggle ensue between the Holy Roman Emperors, who held that they had the power to appoint popes, and the church leaders themselves, who cited centuries of precedent in their claim to that same authority. For decades, popes and anti-popes were appointed and deposed with staggering frequency. All of them, sometimes as many as 3, claiming to be the legitimate successor to the chair of Peter. The powerful popes of the early Middle Ages had by this time given way to weak popes, little more than puppets of foreign rulers. Here's one interesting example. Pope Benedict IX, a debauched reprobate who became pope at the age of 12 in 1032, and resigned at one point in order to sell the papacy to his grandfather, whom he subsequently had deposed. So you can see it's very healthy. It's very... All right. So a few key figures from this period, starting with Emperor Henry III and Pope Leo IX. In the middle of the turmoil, Henry III became Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and determined to put a stop to the papal tug-of-war in Rome. In 1049, he convened a synod in Germany and strong-armed the resignation or deposition of all three rival popes and the election of Leo IX to the papal throne. Leo was already well-schooled in the thought of those who wanted to reform the papacy and take it out of the hands of the princes. So instead of taking his office immediately upon his election, Leo trudged from the synod in Germany all the way to Rome, dressed in a beggar's clothes, refusing to take the office until his election was confirmed by the clergy and people of Rome. Leo was one among many reformers who refused to allow the papacy to be merely a creature of the emperor. Upon Henry's death in 1059, a new pope named Nicholas II issued the papal election decree, which declared that henceforth the cardinals, a select group of bishops designated by the popes, and not the emperors, would elect the popes. But it wasn't until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1179 that we have the system locked in that we do today as far as the pope's election. But you can see that the need to lock that in came from the fact you got three guys claiming they're pope at the same time. That's not going to work. Nicholas's action was masterminded not by him, for he was not by any means an outstanding intellectual or spiritual leader, but by an archdeacon in the Church of Rome named Hildebrand. We're going to want to remember this Hildebrand guy. Hildebrand was widely influential in Rome through the reigns of more than one pope, and carried out his agenda of reform with unbending diligence. In 1073, upon the death of the reigning pope, Hildebrand was literally carried from his home to the center of Rome, where the cardinals quickly ran a formal election to install Hildebrand as pope. And Hildebrand took the title of Gregory VII. Some of you may know. If you don't, it can be confusing. The popes will take a title. They'll have their name, but then they'll take a title, Gregory VII or John the 20th, etc. So now we're at Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII, aka Hildebrand. So Hildebrand took the title Gregory VII. Over the course of his 12-year tenure as Pope, Gregory VII would make papal power unrivaled. He sought to rescue the papacy from the position of degrading servitude it had reached under successive warlords in Italy, which he did by proclaiming the rights and dignities of the Pope more forcefully than anyone ever had before. The papal decree of 1075 stated that no one can judge the Pope, that the Pope alone can appoint and depose bishops, that he can depose kings and emperors, and this rule extends over earthly rulers, who must kiss his feet when they approach him, and that all popes, including himself, naturally are automatically saints. Gregory's pronouncements were also a declaration of war against the practice of investiture. In the same year that he issues them, the Pope deposed and excommunicated no less a person than the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV for trying to overrule the papal choice for Bishop of Milan. Henry responded by deposing the Pope and suggesting that he go and be damned. Gregory secured the allegiance of many lords, and the emperor, this famous episode of history, the emperor, Henry IV, was forced to visit him in disgrace in 1076, made to stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days, before being allowed inside to kiss the papal feet. Never before had the Pope stood so unassailably superior to the secular prince. And though he would die in exile in 1085, this moment would remain a point of great pride for popes for centuries to come. I remember actually in grade school seeing a picture of the guy standing in the snow. Poor Henry. On to Innocent III. Perhaps was not as innocent as we think, but On to Innocent III. After the death of Gregory VII, several powerful popes filled his position, such that the 12th and 13th centuries saw the papacy reach its pinnacle of authority. The greatest of these, and arguably the most powerful of any pope, was Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216. Innocent further solidified the pope's claim to absolute spiritual authority. He declared that the successor of Peter is the vicar of Christ. He has been established as a mediator between God and man, below God but beyond man, less than God but more than man, who shall judge all and be judged by no one. Innocent conceded that kings were given certain functions, but they derived their authority from the popes. Now think of that, how far removed and what a break from the history, from royal history. Remember, part of that huge thing about America becoming a nation was getting a group of people together who could deliberately and specifically put the reins on their own power. That was part of the craziness, in a good way, of the American Revolution. Was this is the majority report of history. The majority report of history is kings. And to have a nation who is trying to constrain itself to this kind of limited self-government is a minority report. So it goes on, as the moon only reflected the light of the sun, so royal power derived its dignity and splendor from pontifical power. A gifted, this is still speaking of Innocent now, a gifted diplomat and politician, he often played the rulers of Europe off one another and gained more and more power for the papacy. Innocent used his power to compel the King of France. Now think how much power this is. He used his power to compel the King of France to take back a wife he had divorced by placing all of France under what was called an interdict, which prohibited the entire nation from partaking in Mass, until the horrified people of France persuaded their king to recant. So he says to the King of France, hey, what's with this divorce business? And the King of France says, I don't get divorced if I want to get divorced. And he says, okay, from here on out, until you do what I say, nobody in your nation can take part in Holy Communion. And in this game of chicken, the King of France budged. So this is not, though, an entirely healthy and biblical scenario. On to the Crusades. The First Crusade. Obviously, the Crusades were major events that defined generations of people. In 1009, the Fatimid Caliph of Cairo, al-Hakim, who controlled Jerusalem at this time, ordered the destruction of the holy places. They were subsequently restored, but Christians who traveled on pilgrimage to Jerusalem were treated more and more harshly. In 1070, the Seljuk Turks conquered Jerusalem from the Fatimids, but they did not treat Christians any better. The Christian response came in 1095, when Pope Urban II declared that Muslim dominance of the Middle East had to be brought to an end. The following year, a series of armies streamed eastward. By 1098, Edessa, Antioch, and Jerusalem were captured and put under Christian rule. For roughly 60 years following the First Crusade, various efforts were made by both Western and Eastern Christians to keep hold of Palestine and some of the surrounding areas against Muslim armies. In one infamous period in history, the Fourth Crusade, as it's been known, was ordered by Pope Innocent III, who we were just talking about. He was trying to strike at the heart of Saladin, the feared and respected Muslim leader. The European crusaders headed off to Egypt. However, this crusade never reached Muslim Middle East. Instead, the crusaders attacked Constantinople, captured it, massacred the population, and installed a Catholic king. The fact that Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and therefore Christian, seems not to have deterred them. Although the Catholic rule of the city lasted only 50 years, and Byzantine rule was later reestablished, the whole incident was possibly the worst point in the history of deteriorating relations between Western and Eastern churches. So it's almost like they're fighting the wrong guys, you know. Well, we don't got enough gas to get to Jerusalem, so is there anybody we can fight here? We're in Constantinople. And the guy's like, wait a minute, we're Christians? We don't care. Just start fighting. Subsequent crusades and the Inquisition. Several other crusades followed, though with little success. The Holy Roman Emperor managed to gain Jerusalem in 1229 by negotiation, but it fell to the Muslims once again in 1244 and would remain in their possession until the 20th century. The Crusades failed to achieve many of their goals. However, the crusading attitude ingrained itself deep into the minds of Europeans. Crusades were launched against Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, against heretical sects, and even against fellow Christians whom the Pope deemed hostile. So Pope Innocent also instituted the Inquisition, which represented the crusading attitude turned towards Christendom. It empowered church authorities to inquire into the orthodoxy of suspected heretics, and to take coercive and often severe measures, including torture and execution, against anyone who could not prove their innocence. The Inquisition was employed inconsistently and sporadically, often depending on the whims of ruler and region. Its most notorious manifestation was the Spanish Inquisition of the late 15th century. So this is an ugly period in church history, full of the sin and folly and pride of man, including up to the highest levels of leadership. How should we as Christians today regard the Crusades? Well, a couple of quick notes before we move on. First, the Crusades hardly left anyone blameless, Christian or Muslim. There was plenty of fault on both sides. Second, because we understand human nature to be sinful, we should not be surprised at the wrongs or even evil sometimes committed in the name of our faith. Our identity is rooted in Christ, not in the past actions of other Christians. Third, we should see the Crusades in the context of the many other problems plaguing the medieval church: corruption, confusion over church and state, political power plays, and especially confusion over how we are saved, not by our efforts, no matter how strenuous, but by God's grace. So that's just a quick overview of the Crusades. On to the next major point, the councils. Number 5. Monastic movements and powerful popes weren't the only means of reform in the Middle Ages. You might remember from previous classes that often great issues of the age were settled by calling a council. This process was called conciliarism. Conciliarism. This was something that was occasionally tried even through the early Middle Ages. For example, when the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 said that it was acceptable to involve images in worship, Charlemagne called a council in Frankfurt that condemned the decision. So there's 2 major councils to be familiar with from this time period, and they're on your sheet. The first is the Fourth Lateran Council from 1215. And it's called the Lateran Council because it was held on the Lateran Hill in Rome. This council was originally called to reform the church, but ended up declaring as dogma several positions that had been debated throughout the Middle Ages, including the doctrine of transubstantiation. Does everybody know what transubstantiation is? Maybe we want to take a whack at it? James, you want to take a...
Sure. Basically the idea that in a sense Christ is in a mystic way almost being re-crucified in the taking of the sacrament, and that there is a literalness to the flesh and blood that it becomes in the transfer to the person.
Once the elements, the bread and the wine, undergo the appropriate blessing, they become literally the body and blood of Christ. Not kind of, sort of, it's literally the body and blood of Christ. Now Catholics would say, of course, it's a mystery, and we don't know how that works, but that's the teaching. The second council you want to be familiar with here is the Council of Constance. At the beginning of the 1400s, yet again, you have three men claiming to be the legitimate pope. It's kind of like you think they needed some sort of American Idol or something to figure out, the popes come on stage and give their best papal presentation. So you got three people claiming to be the legitimate pope. Yet again, the Holy Roman Emperor steps in and deposes all three of them and calls a council to sort out the issue and choose a new pope. The Council of Constance not only chooses a new pope, Martin V, but also declares that councils have the highest spiritual authority in Christendom, and that there should be a new council at least every 10 years, every 5 if possible, to deal with problems in the church. This particular approach to church reform fails when the council makes the mistake of leaving the pope in charge of calling councils. They essentially say, we're going to meet every 10 years, so make sure you bring us back into session, which of course the pope does not do. And Martin V even goes a step farther and says that the Council of Constance, which had appointed him, only has legitimacy because he, as Pope, signs off on its decisions. So conciliarism dies a quick death in the mid-1400s. From thereafter, in Protestant and Catholic circles, never again did councils have the weight, the authority, the imprimatur, the sway that they had in the High Middle Ages. They were important. Protestant ones like Dort, Westminster, Catholic ones, Vatican I, Vatican II, Trent, which was a response to the Protestant Reformation. Very important, but they never held that sway, that life and death sway over people that they reached in that time period. And our last section here, monks, schoolmen, and the roots of the Reformation. Several historical streams had converged that made conditions ripe for the Reformation of the 16th century. Along with the moral decline of the papacy and the evolving political atmosphere in Europe, the monastic revival, and the intellectual movement, scholasticism also contributed to the roots of the Reformation. So beginning with monasticism, which you have on your sheet. While popes like Gregory and Innocent tried to reform from the top, most reform came from much lower in the monasteries. The most important of these orders were the Cluniacs, the Cistercians, and the Franciscans. The Cluniacs, founded in 910 with a grant of property by a duke guilt-ridden over murdering his brother. So there you get a perfect example of, remember how I told you, the secular authorities, this duke is looking for absolution for his sin because he murdered his brother. So he gives a grant of property to an ecclesiastical authority, and that unhealthy relationship just keeps going and going. So the Cluniacs were founded in 910 with a grant of property by a duke guilt-ridden over murdering his brother, and they had a unique charter that kept them completely free from lay control. Cluniac monasteries, emphasizing separation from the world and independence, spread at a rapid pace and soon became quite wealthy in their own right. In a perpetual theme, this wealth soon led the Cluniacs to corruption and calls for a new monastic order. In 1098, the Cistercians were founded, in large part as anti-Cluniacs. Cistercians, not surprisingly, emphasized simplicity, poverty, manual labor instead of scholarship, and private prayer over corporate. Some of their writings remain with us to this day, such as the hymn, O Sacred Head Now Wounded. Cistercians also expanded at an astounding rate, from 5 monasteries in 1119 to 350 in 1150 to 647 houses in 1250. The most eminent Cistercian monk, and perhaps the most famous church figure of his day, was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard served as a sort of spiritual director for much of Europe. His powers of persuasion were so compelling, this is funny, that it was said that mothers hid their sons and wives their husbands when Bernard came recruiting for his monasteries. He wrote a book called On Loving God, which argued that the end of human life is love of God, the end being the goal, whom we should have love for God himself and without limits. Bernard's influence extended long after his death. John Calvin, for example, held him in very high regard. That's funny to have a guy who's so charismatic that when he comes to town, everybody's hiding the husbands and the boys because they don't want them to get, like, he's going to give them the sales pitch about joining the monastery, and they're like, no, we've heard you're persuasive. And lastly, in 1209, Francis of Assisi founded the Franciscans, who took Cistercian frugality one step further by renouncing all worldly possessions. His order also experienced rapid growth as new monks responded to his emphasis on God's goodness and mercy and Christ's perfect humanity. As the Franciscans grew, Francis himself eventually renounced control of the order and went into seclusion. Most of you have probably at least heard of Francis of Assisi. I believe he's the one who's always pictured with, like, the birds sitting on his shoulders, and he's kind of at one with nature. And if you Google image Francis of Assisi, yeah, very similar to a Disney princess. Right.
Come on.
Yeah, let's get. Yeah, Disney needs to get going on their Francis movie. And scholasticism. Now, that scholasticism doesn't sound exciting, but it actually was pretty important. So while monks and friars were busy reforming the monasteries, among the people an important intellectual movement was occurring in the newly formed universities called scholasticism. The goal of the scholastics was to ascertain the relation of faith and reason. They often employed Greek philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle, in this task. In one historical irony, Crusaders had encountered the work of Muslim scholars in studying and translating Aristotle and had brought this recovered learning back to Europe. There was, in having read some Aquinas, who we're going to talk about in a minute, I think the name is Abelard. There was a century or two where Muslim high learning was basically at its peak, from which I don't know that it's ever gone back there. And like this text says, they freely referenced the Greek philosophers, and it was a very high point of Muslim intellectual life, maybe 200 or 300 years worth. And you can see that expressed in architecture as well. There was a high point of Muslim architecture where there was some of those same values that became acquainted with Christendom, the idea of beauty and order and things like that, express themselves in architecture and the life of the mind. But even intellectual giants in Christianity, like Aquinas, would refer back to not only the Greek philosophers, but also both Christian and Muslim interpreters of Aristotle and Plato. So we'll highlight these two guys. Anselm first. One of the most important of the scholastics was Anselm, who lived from 1033 to 1109. Anselm was the Archbishop of Canterbury, an able administrator and a skilled theologian. Strongly influenced by Plato, Anselm held that faith must inform reason. I believe in order that I may understand, he declared. He developed the renowned ontological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument goes like this: God is that than which no greater can be conceived, and whose non-existence would be inconceivable. That's just the bare bones ontological argument. He distrusted human senses and rather urged taking the presupposition of God's existence as a foundation for studying other realms. Perhaps his greatest work was Why God Became Man, in which he connected Christ's incarnation with his atoning death. Anselm emphasized that our sin had so offended a perfect, holy God that no human effort could ever pay our penalty. It could only be paid by the death on the cross of the perfect God-man, Jesus Christ.
What year was this?
He was born 1033, died 1109. Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, for those, a slight excursus here. I went through kind of a circular interest, especially in college, in the fundamentals of right and wrong, or morality. And I ended up kind of going in a big circle, which took me back to the gospel. I started out there, but I went through this big circle, and part of that circle was becoming familiar with Aquinas and natural law. Natural law would be those things as human beings that we can't not know. In other words, we hold somebody accountable. If someone just comes in here and kills Tony for no good reason, I mean, there are a lot of good reasons to kill Tony, but if they do it for no good, I'm just teasing. But then everybody knows intuitively by the witness of God that he put on our hearts, we know deep down that that action was wrong. And natural law says, not only do we know it's wrong, but we can't not know it. And so Aquinas was the best, the most preeminent developer of natural law theory. Aquinas, you can very easily make the case that Aquinas was the best, the greatest, the broadest mind in the last 2,000 years of Christendom, period. That's not a hard case to make. There's others, you could say Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, certainly American theologians, I think Jonathan Edwards is preeminent over the last 300-400 years of American history. But if you look at the last 2,000 years, Aquinas is a giant intellect. He's got two major works, and they're Latin, so I'm going to forget. One is called Summa Contra Gentiles, and one is called the Summa Theologica. Well done, Dora. Ooh, yeah. And it's what he does is he presents a case for Christianity that is here's where he's different from almost all the rest of us. He will find the absolute best arguments against his position and then respond to them. He'll give the other guys the best, present the position, say I'm defending the Trinity. And the way what his writing style does is he picks all the best objections to that. Not the straw men that are easy to push, the best ones. And then he goes back and tackles them. So he was just a brilliant, brilliant person. Now this is before the Protestant Reformation. So if you go to him for his teaching on justification or salvation, is a little bit muddled because it was before the sharp transition of Catholic and Protestant views on justification. Both sides can kind of take him as their guy. Now he's known, he's much wider known in Catholic circles, I think, than in Protestant circles, which is a shame because he's 95% of what he wrote has nothing to do with Catholicism per se, but a giant of the faith. Also developed the first cause argument. Every effect must have a cause. It was a development of Aristotle's theory of the prime mover. Aristotle kind of nibbled around the edges of well, how did we get here? And he had a concept called the prime mover. Aquinas took Aristotle and said, yeah, this is the first cause. Every effect must have a cause. Now, doubting Thomases say, well, then what caused God? And the response is, and I'm surprised that it's used this often by non-believers, because Christians have always maintained that God is self-existent. So he didn't require a cause. Everything else required a cause. Every effect, that's the key word, required a cause. God was not an effect because he was self-existent. So he didn't require a cause. So that's how you get out of, I've heard very, very smart, erudite atheists say, well, then who caused God? And I'm like, you're not reading your opponent's theology, because we've always maintained God as self-existent. He didn't require a cause. That's the clear teaching of Scripture, the Alpha and the Omega, great I am. Always been, always will be. So he helped develop that, and I won't go into too much. I have, for those of you that want to dig deeper, there's some modern writers who have who help people become acclimated to his writing style. He's got a certain style, and it's not easy. You don't just dive in there and start eating it up. It's complex. But Aquinas, big brain, and the without a doubt the king of the scholastics. In fact, what's funny though is his gift for learning evidenced itself at an early age, and he wanted to join a monastery. His family didn't want him to join a monastery. And in fact, they tried to prevent this by tempting him with a prostitute, kidnapping him, and even offering to purchase for him the position of Archbishop of Naples. That's how bad they didn't want him to join the monastery. They tried to tempt him with a project. I mean, can you imagine a family saying, you know, you have this brilliant son who's like, I think I'm destined for the monastery, and their family's like, no. In fact, let's hire the lady of ill repute, see if we can get it done that way, and just try bribery and kidnapping to get him to not join the monastery. There's always drama. That brings us to early reformers. And I'll just do this real quick because I know we're running short on time. You've got Peter Waldo, around 1140 to 1218. He was forceful against the doctrines of transubstantiation and purgatory a couple hundred years before the more well-known reformers. His followers were called the Waldensians. John Wycliffe, late 14th century, Oxford professor, English government official named John Wycliffe. He grew frustrated with all the divisions in the papacy, and he argued that since God ordains authority, those in leadership should follow the example of Christ as humble servants. Obviously, the Wycliffe Bible translators owe their lineage and philosophy to John Wycliffe. He also declared transubstantiation to be false, and I'm not giving him due. Please read up on Wycliffe, because he was a wonderful and very influential. In fact, he was so influential that those who opposed him at the Council of Constance, Wycliffe was declared to be a heretic. They dug his bones up, burned them, and cast his ashes into the river. That's how much the Catholic Church opposed Wycliffe. And then John Huss, who was a Bohemian priest, and who was also put to death and prayed for his oppressors as he was put to death, and had a group of followers known as the Hussites. So again, giving them short shrift. Please, feel free to Google them or look those guys up in your. These were some of the well-known forerunners of the Augustinian monk named Martin Luther, who would come on the scene in 1517, go to the door at Wittenberg with his 95 Theses and blow everything up. So that brings us to the end of the High Middle Ages and the end of the first 1400 or so years of Christianity. And hopefully we'll dig back into it later this year, maybe, and get into the Reformation.